Hello class, and welcome to my video here dealing with our pedigrees. I will not be in class today because I'm dealing with a sick child, so you'll have a substitute, but this is your video walkthrough of how we do pedigrees, because regardless if I am there or not, we are still going to continue forth and onwards into our great glorious studies into genetics. Now what a pedigree is, if you turn to page number 7 in your packet, a pedigree is this kind of diagram that has a bunch of shapes and some of them are filled in. This is basically like a genetic family tree, and we're going to walk through page number 7 together here to give you an example of all the things that you can kind of expect as you're going through a traditional style of pedigree here. But first we're going to look at the chart that's on page number 7 and look at what things we use to represent the different things that you'll see on the chart. First thing here, as I have over here, we are going to use a square to represent a male. That's just the standard traditional shape that is chosen. We have a circle to represent a female. Most of you will be very familiar with those two things because they're shapes and you've been doing them since you've been probably 2 years old. If you shade in a trait or a shape, that usually means that they are going to have the specific trait that we are going to deal with. Most of the time, we are going to deal with shaded circles and squares if they are going to be recessive. Now if it's empty, usually that's going to represent our dominant, which if you look at any of our pedigrees throughout the packet here, usually you'll see very little shaded areas and a lot of the empty boxes. So usually we are going to use the recessive as being shaded and the non-shaded as being dominant here. Also, in our pedigree, there will be lines connecting things together. If there's a line connecting two individuals together like this, where there's just a straight line connecting them, that means they are married. They're husband and wife. If they have a line coming off of them, with multiple shapes then coming off, these would represent their children. Typically, you put the firstborn on the leftmost side and the youngest one over on the right. So they basically go in order. So this would be the oldest over here, and the middle here would be the middle child, and then this would be the youngest over there. So that's how you'll traditionally also read these. So this here itself is a pedigree, and we're going to look at some of the questions that are on page number 7 here together to kind of walk through our general stuff dealing with our pedigrees. First off, let's look at our actual shapes. So let's count up how many males we have in our pedigree. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There are 8 squares, so we have 8 males. Let's assume that all the shaded ones represent the recessive trait. Let's count how many are recessive. 1, 2, 3. There's 3 recessive males. Whoop. There we go. So that's pretty easy, right? Let's do the same thing for the females. How many females are in the pedigree? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We've got 8 of them because there's 16 people in our entire pedigree here. I just numbered them instead of giving them names. Some of the ones that you'll deal with later have actual names to them. These ones I just gave numbers. And let's look at how many females are recessive. In this case, let's look back at our pedigree. 1 at the bottom here and a second one at the top. So that would be number 2. We can look at how many marriages there are. So how many are connected together. We've got our first marriage up at top. Now this would be the oldest couple here, because you usually start up at the top with the oldest, and at the bottom is going to be the youngest generation. So this is like basically great-grandma and grandpa. This would be grandma and grandpa, and this would be mom and dad if you were a kid on the bottom row here. So there are actually 3 couples in our little genetic family history here, or our pedigree. Now the Roman numerals there on the side, you just heard me referencing them just a little bit ago, 1, 2, 3, and 4. These represent our generations. So this is basically saying that there are 4 generations. And for each one, we can count up how many there are in there. There's 2 in the first generation, 3 in the second, 4 in the third, and then we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in generation 4. And these are just your standard type of just getting more familiar with the actual pedigree itself. You'll answer some questions about some of the other pedigrees in a similar fashion. Before we actually get into how the genetics work in it, we can look at how many children each one of the couples have. So let's look at couple number 1. Couple number 1 here would have 2 children. Since this was a person that married into the family, it wouldn't count as their children. Note that there isn't a line extending down there, but rather they're all separate over here, so they would just have 1 kid, 2 kids there. Boop. So they would have 2 children. Let's look at row number 3, how many children they would have. Well, we already counted that up when we counted up how many were in generation 7, or generation 4, which would have been 7. That was the same kind of answer as one before there. Now here's where we get with question number 10. Here's the meat and potatoes of what we end up doing with our pedigrees, is that we can actually trace the genetic traits throughout the family history. And how pedigrees are a little bit different than our Punnett squares is that Punnett squares are used to predict the potential outcomes of the kids. A pedigree actually traces the legitimate history of everybody in the family. And you can do this to try to track, you know, if something has been passed down from generation to generation. So, you know, some doctors end up using these, you know, when they'll ask you like, oh, is there any family history of such and such, of this disease or this condition? Basically, they're using a version of a pedigree to figure out what are the chances of you getting this kind of, you know, condition or disease there. Now, they might not do the whole square and circle thing, but they're doing the basics of a pedigree in order to do that. But let's look at this. So in genotypes, as it says, can be found in pedigree by first looking at people who are recessive. Because remember, recessives are always 2 lowercase letters. So we're going to look at each one of these ones that are recessive in our pedigree, and we're just going to put a little a underneath every one of the shaded boxes. And there's going to be 5 of them here, so we're going to have 5 little a's. So we got number 2, number 8, 10, 12, and 13 all being recessive. Let's see if I can remember that here. So we had 2, 8, 10, 12, and 13. I apologize for my sloppy handwriting. I'm actually writing all this with a mouse, which isn't the best for controlling things like that. So we have 5 recessive people. Males and females, so this is where it gets a little bit trickier. Males and females who are dominant are a little bit trickier because they have 2 possible genotypes, and we talked about this when we did Punnett squares. However, as we talked about with the Punnett squares, we would know for certain that all dominant people would at least have 1 capital letter. So what we're going to do with the pedigree now is we're going to put a capital A next to each one of our unshaded boxes or empty boxes and circles here, because we would know for certain that in order to show the dominant trait, they would have at least 1 capital letter. Let me finish this one off here with number 16. Alright, now let's look back at the rest of what this says here. Typically you'd start at the bottom, because the easiest way to figure out if the second letter is a capital or a lowercase is to look at the people's parents. And since the youngest is always at the bottom, it's easier to start at the bottom and work your way up to the top. As it says here, if one of the kids' parents is a little a, that means every single kid that they would have at least 1 little a allele, because this parent would only be capable of donating a little a in that situation. So that's why we start at the kids and look what their parents are. So we can look at the chart, and all people who have a recessive parent would at least have 1 recessive allele. So let's go and look at that. So since this parent is recessive, that means every single one of these children should have at least 1 recessive allele. So since they're getting the big one from, what is that? That would be mom with the circle there. Each one of these would be getting a recessive allele from dad. Now, since we also have recessive children here, and they were getting 2 little a genes here, that means not only dad gave them a recessive version, But that must mean mom also gave them a recessive version as well. So we can actually figure out what mom is in that situation by having a little a. Let's back it up to up top here. Since dad is recessive, he would have had to get a little a from his mom and a little a from his dad. Well, since both mom and dad don't show the trait and they're dominant, we would know that their second letter would also be a little a, or a little a for each of them, meaning that they would have had to donate each a little a themselves in order to get dad here, or I guess it would be their son, the little a combination. Here's where you can be thrown for a loop, though. These two, we will not be able to figure out what their other letter is, because they could be big A, or they could be big A, little a. We don't know because it wouldn't make a difference for how we fill in the box, and they wouldn't be showing the trait in either one of those situations. Until they have kids, and then we could possibly figure it out, we would not know. In those kind of cases, we just put a little dash mark next to them, because it could either be big or little, we don't know, so we kind of leave it blank. And that's what you do for any of them that we can be undetermined at the time. For number 3 up here, since it's dominant, but mom up here as number 2 has a little a, that meant she would have given her daughter the little a. However, for great-grandpa here at the very top, since neither one of these are little a, we do not know if grandpa actually contained the recessive trait. We know that mom did because mom had the trait. That's how these ones ended up getting their little a. We do not know what great-grandpa is, though. So he would also be an undeterminable genotype up there and would just have the little slash. And that's how you would basically walk through one of these pedigrees. We have solved everybody's genotype, all 16 of them, by just looking at, where they came from. Starting with the recessives first, putting down what all of our dominants are, and then continuing forward. For the rest of the time that you have in class here, you're going to do the next couple of pages, actually the rest of the packet. On page 8, you'll have this other pedigree here. Same kind of rules will apply. The shaded colors are going to be the recessive trait. The empty ones here are going to be the dominant trait. These ones I just ended up giving names, so there's some names to go along with the circles and squares to go along with that one. On page 9, you got another pedigree there. And finally, on page 10, you'll end up having a couple of pedigree problems where you will have to create the pedigree itself by reading through the story. My suggestion for those is to take it one step at a time, look at each sentence individually, and be able to create parts of the pedigree off of that. And just kind of walk through it step by step there. Now I'm hopefully going to be there on Friday, because hopefully this is just a 24-hour thing and he's all better for tomorrow. So tomorrow we'll look over and talk about any of these that you would want to, turn in our packets for the week, and do a little activity involving our pedigrees to make sure that we've got it, since I wasn't there to kind of oversee things today. But you'll have the rest of the hour to kind of work on your pedigrees, listen to the substitute, don't get your name written down, and I'll see you tomorrow.